Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Zoom presentation from the Dearborn Heights Libraries. We present to you Michigan Wildlife with Andrew Nowicki. Andrew is a naturalist and environmental education with a degree in zoology from Michigan State University. He runs programs across the state of Michigan where he teaches audiences about the connections between wildlife, people, and society and how to experience more during their time outdoors. So go ahead and take it away, Andrew.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm a naturalist, environmental educator, and for most of my life, most all my life, I've just been a dude that's really interested in going outside and experiencing things. So what I bring to these programs is not only the technical background from school, but also a lifetime of stories and experiences. And most of the images that I use in these programs are also my own. This is my camera, me taking a picture here on the right. And if it's not my images, it's pretty plainly marked and so forth. So the purpose of this presentation is that I want you to be able to tune in and experience and hear a lot of new things about a lot of cool animals. But my ultimate goal is that after this program, you'll be able to go outside and experience or see something new that you hadn't been able to experience before. So I do touch a lot of different stuff. Instead of focusing on one or two species in a lot of detail, I'm going to tell you about a lot of different cool things that you can see right here in Michigan, many of which right specifically in Southeast Michigan. Um, uh, and I kind of want to give you an idea of what's out there, because the real secret to seeing more in nature is anticipation, not just observation. So having an idea in the back of your head on what do you expect to see, where do you expect to see it, how do you expect to view it, and that's really what makes these things really come out. And it's the difference between noticing something or walking past it and never knowing that it's there. So like you'd imagine that you're in a woods and you're paying attention, you're really observant and you're quiet and you want to see more animals. And what I've heard from audiences across the state is that people have no problem seeing the big stuff. You know, as long as you're paying attention and you're spending time in the outdoors, chances are that you're going to come across something like a white-tailed deer. Because they're big, they're very difficult to miss as long as you're paying attention out there. And deer are actually a forest edge species, not just a forest species. So a lot of the habitats that humans create kind of make those forest borders matching like lawns and general field areas. So we actually create quite a bit of deer habitat throughout the state in our human development. Something else a lot of people see is turkeys. You know, again, it's not just a bird, it's a big bird. When they're in the area, as long as you're out there observing them, you're gonna see them. Here's a picture I actually took from a car. I was not driving, but it was a moving vehicle. And I was able to spot these turkeys just from the side of a road on a more kind of a rural setting. So as long as they're big, they stand out and people notice them. So there's all these other types of wildlife that are present that don't always get noticed because maybe you need a bit more of information about them to be able to pick them out, or maybe they require looking in a specific kind of place that you don't get from just taking a walk in the woods and looking around with your bare eyes. So I'm actually going to play a sound right now, and this is a sound that throughout the state you're very likely to hear, but maybe you didn't realize quite what it was. So I'll play it first. And this is the sound of an eastern chipmunk. I've had a lot of audiences think that sounds an awful lot like a bird. And one of the ways that you can really start to experience more wildlife, this is my first tip in the program, is to start learning your sounds and not just relying entirely on your eyes. So the chipmunk actually gets its name because it does this. It makes a chip note. And it's actually an alarm note. It's not just a means of communication. The chipmunk is making this chip, 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 chip noise to let other animals in the area know that I see something big and scary. I'm worried that it might eat me, and I want everyone to be aware that there's something out there that's dangerous. So if you're walking in an outdoor setting and you hear a chipmunk really close to you making that noise, there's a good chance it could actually be talking about you, because humans, we're much bigger than chipmunks. We're big and we can be very intimidating and scary. But it's also a good trick for finding other kinds of wildlife too. So if you learn different animals' alarm calls, which is what we would consider this, because it's not for communication, it's for, and by communication, it's not talking to other chipmunks, it's saying, I see something scary and I want others to know that it's there, right? That's an alarm call. When you pick this up, if you hear a chipmunk making an alarm call from maybe somewhere that far away from you, there's a chance that it's making that call at another cool animal that you might want to check out. Maybe there's a coyote or like a hawk or something in a tree or something else like a snake that's intimidating that chipmunk and making it have that call. And so when you start to learn these, you can use those calls to also find other animals that are causing that disturbance. Um, and having sounds is really important, not just for learning the calls that the animals actually make, but the noises from what animals actually do. So I've encountered that often if I'm walking on a trail, I will hear the sound of like a snake slithering through the grass. And that can sometimes be the first thing that tips me off that there's a snake in this area, as opposed to just trying to find one visually. So for this particular trail, I'm walking down a nature path and I hear this tapping noise. It's a very soft, like a tap, 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 over and over again, coming up from the tops of the trees. And I look up and I see there is the butt of a pileated woodpecker. This is the largest woodpecker that we have in the state. Very beautiful orange, red crest. And often when we hear woodpeckers, they also make this other noise that sounds like a brrrr, and it's really loud. And when we hear that, when I was younger, I used to always imagine in the back of my head that this is a noise of a woodpecker drilling a hole. Is that brrrr, it sounds like a jackhammer. But if you pay attention, you can actually hear often when a woodpecker makes that noise, you'll hear something else responding to it off in the distance. You'll hear the brrrr, and then in the distance you'll hear brrrr, and they'll go back and forth. So that banging is actually intentionally being noisy. They're trying to communicate with one another. Whereas when they're actually drilling into the tree, even though this is a really large woodpecker, it can't get any bigger for a woodpecker in Michigan, it was making a fairly soft, fairly subtle sound up there, just this soft tap, 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 tap. And then knowing that call tipped me off to it, even though it wasn't necessarily a means of communicating with other birds. But if you're a bird watcher, you're going to experience this a lot. You're going to be spending a lot of time looking up in the trees with binoculars, and there's actually jokes that bird watchers make about getting sore necks, especially during the migratory season when you're spending a lot of time looking up. And this picture wasn't quite satisfactory for me at the time, so I actually climbed the tree next to this woodpecker, and he allowed me to get up there, and I was able to take a much clearer, better picture of this. So you can see more of what the pileated woodpecker looks like. Um, and also notice that what they leave behind after they're drilling into the tree are these little holes here. And different woodpeckers have different shapes and different types of holes that they drill into the tree. From the trying to eat like sap or other kinds of insects, things that are inside the wood, maybe eating at the heart of the tree. So another dude that comes through, it migrates, so this is one that you more see in the spring and the fall when they're moving through, is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Notice he's got a yellow belly and he likes to eat sap. So he's very aptly named, even though his name might sound like a bit of an insult. I'd imagine like if you went up to somebody on the street and you called them, you yellow-bellied sap sucking, maybe don't do that, it doesn't sound very nice. But they're a really cool bird. And when you can tell that they're there, even if you don't find the actual bird around, because they leave this very distinctive hole pattern on the trees that they go to. And that's because they're trying to get the sap, just like their name implies. So they're making these little holes and they drill in a horizontal pattern. So you can see how this almost kind of lines up like a straight line right down the tree. This is actually a zoomed in version of this section right here. And they're doing this so that way when the sap is moving up and down the tree on the outside, they're draining it and they're able to lick at it and extract it from the outsides. And the yellow-bellied sapsucker is the only woodpecker that really does this in that particular pattern. So you can tell that they're there even if you don't actually find the bird, because these holes stick around for a long time. All right, make sure we clear that. Another woodpeckers, this particular one, this is a hairy woodpecker. The downy woodpecker is another variant that looks very similar to this, but has a slightly smaller beak. They often make much smaller holes, usually rounder, not necessarily rectangular and oval like the pileated does, So you can kind of see a little bit of the pattern. This dude's actually making another one here. This is the one that he was working on earlier in this particular image that he chopped off this tree. And again, what the woodpeckers are doing is they're trying to find little insects and things that they can eat on the inside. So often the trees that you see them drilling on also have other holes and signs of insects having activity and eating in those trees as well. And cool facts about woodpeckers is that their skull does not have any hollow space in their brain cavity. And this is one of the adaptations that they have to make sure that when they're banging their head against something multiple times throughout the day, they're not giving themselves any kind of traumatic brain injury. For humans, we actually have a little bit of space in between our skull and our brain. So your brain is actually technically floating inside of your head. And that's why when you get, hit or you get into an accident, your brain can actually move inside your skull and it creates damage that way. So the woodpeckers have evolved to make sure that they don't have that space. It's all really enclosed. So when they're banging on something, they don't get that concussion effect that you can get in other animals, which is pretty neat. This little dude is one you're probably likely to see a lot of bird feeders and such around the state too. This one is aptly named the yellow-bellied, red-bellied woodpecker. But I love this particular image because it's one of the few places where you can actually see a little bit of the reddish tint on the belly. When they're a little bit farther away from this branch, the red belly doesn't really stand out all that much. It looks very white. And so I've heard them get confused for another bird called the red-headed woodpecker, which is not very common in Michigan. It has a completely yellow head, not just the red crest. And something about some of these birds, especially this red-bellied woodpecker, is that they can be jerks. So this is a photo. This is not from Southeast Michigan. This is a bird feeder from up north. But here we've got a red-bellied woodpecker stopping by, and even though there's plenty of seed here on the bird feeder, he gets a little bit anxious about his space, and he doesn't want to just share with the other birds. He's chasing them away, and then grabbing a couple seeds and then heading off. So birds can be jerks too. It's not just people. Poor thing, but he looks really, really happy with what he's done. I'm sure the other bird is not very pleased about getting chased off. All right, another helpful trip to seeing more wildlife is to have an understanding ahead of time of what is their behavior. What is it about their behavior that can give me some indication of where they are? So in this image, I love to show this one because it's a picture that I could imagine many of us on a trail, and you would just walk right past this and never have a second glance. And so the first thing to notice here is that we've got a fallen tree. And when we've got a forest with a dense cavity and you have a tree that falls down, this creates a path of light. So you've got more light shining through because this tree that used to have its leaves up there blocking out a lot of the sunlight, it's gone. So you've got a hole in that canopy. And reptiles are cold-blooded. So if they need to get warm, they've got to go out in the sunlight or go somewhere warm in order to warm up their bodies. They're not like people in which we can actually speed up our metabolism when we're cold, or we can just put on a jacket. Snakes unfortunately don't have tailors going around knitting them little sweaters like we do. Very unfortunate. So if we see an area where we see that maybe a reptile would spend some time sunning itself, that's a tip to me that I should maybe go there and look for things like snakes and lizards. And oftentimes when they're basking, they don't actually go on top of the log, which might be where you'd intuitively think to look. Sometimes they will, but these animals are also things that could get eaten. Garter snakes are going to eat like frogs, worms, other small things, but they could also get picked off by a hawk. They might get eaten by a coyote or something else that's hungry and wandering about there. So they want to make sure that they're staying safe while they're trying to get themselves warm. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. So at this point, you might be able to pick out and find the animal hidden in this picture before I completely point it out. So they're going to be hiding in a place that's open and accessible to the sunlight, so they get all the benefits of warming up and soaking up that sun. But at the same time, they're in the brush just enough that if they see something scary that they don't like, they can get away, they can go into the thick vegetation, and they know they're going to be safe. So they don't always necessarily go right out in the open. You kind of look for them at the edges, these patches where they might be able to go there and hide. And we'll zoom in here one more time, and now you can probably see him. This is the garter snake right here, hiding in that patch. And just for showing it, I'm also going to backtrack. Oh, back up one slide, and you can see him hiding right here at the base. So you can see he's exposed enough that he's soaking in the sun, but if he really needs to escape, he can dive into these brush and you're never going to be able to find him and catch him in there. All right, and some other animals are a little bit better at hiding in plain sight. So this is another image that if you're watching, you can try to find the hidden animal before I explicitly point it out. There's something hiding here. And this one's in plain sight. So this is relying on color to be able to blend in with its surroundings as a form of camouflage. And this particular animal, right here in Michigan, has the ability to change its color, kind of like a chameleon or a cuttlefish. But unlike those animals, it can't do it instantaneously. It takes a couple hours. It's more of a gradual change, but this animal can still do it. We're going to zoom in a little bit more, and maybe you can start to pick this one out. I'm actually going to highlight him. Here is the frog, hiding in plain sight here on a little swamp log. And here I'm going to show you a different view. This is the same species. This is a eastern gray tree frog. And they are tree frogs. They've got sticky pads on their toes and they can climb right up wood. They can climb right up branches. You might hear them on the very, very tops of the trees. They can also climb on glass, and you sometimes see them sticking to the sides of buildings and things too. And they can change their color from gray to green to match the background. So here in this next picture, I've got a stick here that's a little bit grayish in color, and there's some kind of greenish patches here too. There's some moss, maybe some lichen on that branch. And the frog is actually mimicking that coloration. So we've got the same kind of grayish pattern and then some green also visible on the back. These frogs just blend in absolutely perfectly. All right, so let's say that we're going to a wetland. And before you even get there, I'm going to say this again. Anticipation, not just observation, is the secret to seeing lots more wildlife. So be thinking about where am I going to find animals and what kind of animals might I expect to see at a wetland like this? So when I do this kind of program, a variant of it for children, we'll actually go up to a wetland, and before we get to that point, I'll ask them, what kind of animals might you expect to see? Would you expect to see a frog? Would you expect to see the frog up there in the tree? Unless it's a tree frog, no, you're going to see it by the shoreline. And this really does help. So one of the tricks I'm going to show you is raptors. Raptors are a bird of prey. It's not something from Jurassic Park. The word raptor just means any bird of prey. So yes, we have raptors, probably in your own backyard. And raptors love to perch in big, tall, open spaces that don't have a lot of foliage, that have a very clear pane of view. So here we've got an accipiter species that's sitting up at the very top of a tall branch on a tree, wide open. We see the bird sticking up there. And so many different raptors in Michigan do this. So if you think that you go to an area and you see, it could be a telephone pole, it could be a large dead tree with some barren, barren branches on it, cell phone towers, even some buildings. You go up and see these spaces and you just scan your eyes over them really quickly and check to see if there's any raptors perching up there on the top, because this is such a common behavior among all of these different groups. So this one is a red-tailed hawk that's perched up on a power line here. Here we have an osprey. This is a species that you exclusively see near the water. They only eat things like fish for the most part. So usually going to be by a water, but at the same time, they do the same thing. We have a bare branch and he's sitting up there on top. This little dude up here, this is called an American kestrel, and they are the smallest falcon species that we have in Michigan. And the place that I see them the most is just like they're pictured here, sitting on top of wires or these power structures while you're driving or just taking a walk through an area. And oftentimes I feel like they get confused with something like maybe a pigeon or a mourning dove or starling or some other kind of bird that also tends to perch up on these power line structures quite often. But unlike those birds, this little dude, he is a predator. This is a falcon. They eat little birds. They eat, insects, maybe dragonflies and things like that too. So they're out there to catch food. That's what they're looking for. And when you eat other birds, it's a very, very bad way of making friends. So you're often just going to see them up there by themselves. And one of the ways that you can cue in on this, besides just seeing one bird up there by itself, no one else around it, is that they also tend to wag their tail. So if you see a bird on a power line by itself, about, pigeonish size, but you don't get it necessarily a really good look. You see that bird wagging its tail back and forth, you're probably looking at an American kestrel. All right, but we also have to be aware of some of these tricks of getting used to looking for something specific, having an idea in your head of what it is that you want to see, because our mind can play tricks on us. So here is this is the bird that I took a picture of while I was actually out at a birding hotspot. I was looking for a very rare bird that was normally native to Florida, and it got lost, and it had happened to be in Michigan. So I'm searching this area for raptors, and I know that raptors like to perch up on these open spaces on the tops of things like power lines and trees and bare branches. And I see a structure on top of a pole that looks like it could be a raptor, and I pull the car over, I jump out, get out my camera, and I start taking pictures of it. Only then did I take a closer look, and I realized this is not a bird. This is a fake bald eagle that someone put up there. I don't know if it's for decoration. This is a known birding hotspot that this was taken in, so I don't know if they maybe knew that like bird watchers would come by and take pictures of this inadvertently. But I send this as a word of caution that when you start to pick up what animals are in an area and you start to expect what animals you're going to see, sometimes it's possible to project the animal that you want something to be onto something that it really isn't. So one cautionary tale that I'll say is take a second look and take your time in really getting to know these animals and identifying what they are for certain, because people, even experienced bird watchers, can make mistakes sometimes. All right, this dude, I'm gonna actually circle him a little bit because this might be a little bit hard to see. This is actually a peregrine falcon, which you can actually see in uh, cityscapes, like literal cityscapes, like downtown Detroit. You can go there and see this because the tall buildings actually mimic their natural habitat, which would be like on cliffs and steep sides. This is one of the fastest birds. Actually, I believe it is the fastest bird on the planet. I think I got muted for a sec there. So let me step back. So this is one of the fastest birds on the planet. I believe it's the fastest bird. They can dive at speeds of over 200 miles an hour going after their prey. And they'll eat things like pigeons and other birds, but they will also eat ducks, which is something that we see on this image right here. I wasn't able to identify what species of duck it was that it grabbed and it flew away with. But one of the places that I've seen peregrine falcons is not only in cityscapes. So you've got tall skyscrapers, tall buildings, and they'll be perching up and actually nesting in those buildings sometimes. But you also see them by the water. So I've seen them actually by like the Detroit River and some lakes and things over there because they'll come by and they'll pick up ducks that are even about the same size as they are. They're quite incredible, quite fast birds too. When you see them, you know they're really built for speed. They whiz across that landscape like nothing else. All right, and when we're identifying a lot of these animals, it's also important to make sure that you have the right equipment sometimes. So I like to show this picture because for most of us, if you're just going for a casual hike in the outdoors somewhere, a lot of hawks and other birds too, this is what they look like in all purposes. It doesn't look like the super zoomed in National Geographic magazine photo where you can very clearly identify the bird and you can see all of its particular features and so forth. A lot of these animals tend to be very far away. And throughout Southeast Michigan, during the migratory season, spring and fall, you can sometimes see these large kettles of hawks. A kettle is like a group of hawks. It's kind of like a T, really cool name. And they'll soar in these kind of circular structures. What they're actually doing when you see them soaring is they're catching a drift of wind that's carrying them up into the air. So flying up takes up a lot of energy. You've got to flap your wings quite hard to get yourself higher elevation. So they're going to take advantage if they have any kind of a drift or some kind of wind or current that's bringing them up. You'll see them all in a kind of a circle taking advantage of this. Vultures do it, other hawks do it too when they're migrating. I've seen, there's like a rumor sometimes that when people see this like circulating motion for birds of prey, that it's like maybe there's something dead or like something they're trying to eat on the underside there. That's usually not really true. They're using that to catch up the updrift of winds to help them get higher without expending more energy. If they are circling around something, they're going to be pretty close to the ground, not really high up like that. Oop. So one of the ways that bird watchers and naturalists start to pick out these animals from afar away, if you don't have the optics for it, is to start to identify their behavior and the ways in which they fly. And one of those hawks, this is a rough-legged hawk, has a really particular way that it goes about hunting. Let's play the video here. So you notice that this is a video that I took, and the wind is moving, but the camera isn't, and the bird is not moving. It's completely still, and it's got this hovering behavior in midair. And this is how they hunt, because normally this is a species that is in an area that doesn't have a lot of things that it can perch on. It's native normally to like these vast fields and such. So as such, it's more of a bird that you see during the migratory seasons. But you can immediately tell that this is probably a rough-legged hawk by when you see this hovering motion from a distance. So you can see in the camera, this isn't some super close zoomed in photo. It's pretty dark. You can't see a lot of the features and coloration on the bird, but just from that pattern, the way it's flapping its wings and hovering in midair, we can tell apart that this is a rough-legged hawk from a distance. Oop. Conversely, the ones that you most often see here are the red-tailed hawks. In fact, if you're in the lower peninsula of Michigan and you see a hawk, I would assume that it's a red-tailed hawk unless you can prove otherwise, because they're by far the most commonly seen hawk that we have in the state. And that's because this is an edge species. They love to live in areas that are at the border between where you have a forest and lots of tall trees and maybe a kind of a field, a structure like that. And what they do to hunt is they perch themselves up on top of a structure and they look down and they're looking to see if there's any kind of mice or chipmunks or small rodents, mammals, and things moving about down there. And then they jump from their perch, leap down on top of it and grab it. And sometimes they'll eat it there on the spot. Sometimes you'll see them fly back up to their perch and they'll eat it up there on the perch where it's maybe a little bit more safe. But this is the way that they hunt. They need somewhere to perch on to be able to do this. So other birds, like the rough-legged hawk, they pick up this behavior of hovering because they don't live in an area that has trees like that, where they're able to do that perching motion for hunting. And when you see red-tailed hawks in flight, you can often see too that they're very aptly named because they have a red tail in the back. But I do caution that when red-tailed hawks are younger, they don't always have that red tail quite developed yet. So another thing that you can look for is this band along their chest. You see it's got kind of a bare top of the chest, and there's a very clear band across right here. And again, if you're not really into bird watching and know these birds, if you see a hawk, I would just assume that it's a red tail until you have reason to believe otherwise, because it's definitely the one that you're seeing more often than any other hawk species. So this dude, I guess this is a good intro too. So you've heard me talk a few times during the program already about optics. So some of these animals that, like I showed you before about how the hawks are all really far away and they can be difficult to see. Sometimes to be able to see them better, it's just a matter of having like binoculars that are really powerful. Something else that you see a lot of naturalists purchase is this. This is called a spotting scope. I don't know if you can see me in the little video here, I hope so. But I'm showing you, this is my spotting scope. And it looks kind of like a telescope. It's even got a little tripod attached to it. But whereas a telescope is more designed to be looking up towards the stars, this is designed to look out more horizontal. So the shape of it is a little bit different. And this is what allows you to get some really good zoom to be able to see these features. And you can identify not just birds, but mammals and reptiles from very far away using some equipment like this as well. And I wanted to bring this up now because this picture that I'm showing you of a raptor was actually taken with a cell phone through the lens of a spotting scope. So I wanted to show that you don't need to buy a fancy dancy camera to be able to take really quality wildlife photos. You can take them through binoculars or through a spotting scope if you don't have the big fancy lenses and such like that too. And they still come out pretty great. You can see this is a pretty clear picture, I think. So this image, by the way, is actually a bald eagle. And not everyone necessarily notices that at first because Look at that. It doesn't look like a bald eagle. It doesn't have the white head. It doesn't have the white tail. Bald eagles actually take several years to get that characteristic white head, white tail look. And in the meantime, they look a little bit like this. They're pretty brown. They've got some mottling, kind of like whitish speckles and spots on them as well. But one thing that you can really tell, first, it's a very big bird. Compared to other birds, like if you're used to seeing hawks and even turkey vultures and things, bald eagles stand out because they're big. Oh, I guess we can show this part. But something else to narrow in on is that look at this big stocky beak, and it's very yellow. Even at a younger age, you can see some yellowish on the beak, and also those feet are all that bright yellow color too. Other birds of prey might have like yellowish feet, but I've not seen them to be that gaudy. Like they really are very bright, even from a distance, and they're very large. And it gets even easier when you see a bald eagle in flight, not only because they have really, really big wings, but they are masters of T-pose. It's a thing that maybe only the younger people would get. So the T-pose is this internet meme where people stand out with their arms completely outstretched. And it almost looks like you could take a board and it's completely flat and it goes right across from their wings when they're flying. And so bald eagles, you can tell them apart because they have this really straight line going across when they fly. Other birds of prey that you might see soaring from a distance, they'll make kind of like a V shape. And even sometimes, if it's not something like this, like osprey can actually make kind of this like a gull shape you might see in like artwork and such. They don't have it completely outstretched and straight like that. So if you see a bird and you see they've got these really straight, really large wings and they're soaring really high up in the air, and it's too far away for you to be able to really narrow in and see what it is, just from that straight wings, you know that you're looking at an eagle. Oop, I think next slide. Something else I've noticed, just FYI, is that bald eagles sometimes look a lot like great blue herons. I've had people say that they think I'm crazy for this, but you can't always see close up to see that they've got that head and that those feet that are sticking out the back. If you're looking at a forward profile of a great blue heron, the way that their wings fly can actually be very similar to a bald eagle. So look out for that, especially from a distance. Oop. Another bird, the turkey vulture, which also spends a lot of time up in the air soaring, and they're only here during the summertime because they eat dead things. That's actually why they've got this bald head. So ironically, the bald eagle isn't actually bald, it's just got a white head. The turkey vulture actually is bald, and we call it a turkey because it's got a reddish head. And this is really good for the turkey vulture because when they're sticking their head inside carcasses and dead and things that might be kind of gooey and slimy, they don't want to get lots of gunk up there on their head where it's hard for it to clean off, and they're worried about getting dirty. So it's much more sanitary to just get rid of all the feathers altogether, and that's why they have that bald look. Turkey vultures are also one of the few bird species that have a really good sense of smell. Most birds don't have a very good sense of smell, if any sense of smell at all. But these guys can detect a carcass from several miles away. That's how developed it is. And they need that to be able to find their food. And they move away during the wintertime because it gets below freezing. And so what happens is that when things die, even if you see carcass on the side of the road, they freeze. And once they freeze, the turkey vultures aren't very adept at eating them anymore. So they have to move further south during the cold season to be able to accommodate for that. The only ways that you see turkey vultures around during the wintertime is generally when they have some alternative source of food. Like I've seen like the Detroit Zoo and like other locations where they have food out that they can kind of scavenge. You sometimes still see them persist even in the wintertime. And when vultures fly, you're looking at a vulture because they got a V. V for vulture. If they have a V shape on their wings, see how the wings are kind of dipping upward a little bit here? That's a for sure indicator that you're looking at a vulture flying, as opposed to that bald eagle, which is very straight and just has a line. So bald eagles, this is a picture of a bald eagle nest. And you'll notice it's really big. Bald eagles are a pretty big bird, and this nest actually almost makes it look smaller in comparison. And when they nest, they don't make it, they do come to the same spot every year, and they build a new nest every single season, but they build their new nest on top of their old nest. So every single year, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They build a story on top. And yes, eventually these nests can get so big that they can actually fall out of the tree and collapse. And that has happened before. It's inevitable eventually with these. Um, but during the winter months, you can also check out nests for things like bald eagles, because there's another animal that's going to be taking advantage of those nests and actually using them while the bald eagles are away and nesting. And that is owls. So many owl species will take advantage of nesting cavities and areas of birds of prey that have moved away during the summertime, and they're taking advantage of them during the winter. And here in this picture, there is actually an owl. Again, this one's a little bit more representative of what you might see if you're actually in the wild. They can be really hard to see. So I've got a brief story about experiencing owls in the wild in Michigan. I was with a group of bird watchers. These are bird watchers, people who are experienced looking for birds, looking at birds. And there's like a dozen of us. And we're around this group of trees, pine trees, and we know that there's a group of owls that love to roost there. And we're looking and we're looking and we're looking up and down with the binoculars, and we're staying very quiet while this is all going on. But as we keep looking and we don't find them, we start to think that maybe they're not there. So suddenly some conversation starts. We start talking a little bit. Conversation starts to grow. We're talking louder. We're talking louder. And then a great horned owl flies right out from this group of trees that 10 birders had been staring at and unable to find it the entire time. Um, so at this point, we're all shocked and we're kind of grumbling, oh my gosh, we missed it, we scared it off. We start to walk away, and as we walk away, the noise level gets louder, it gets a little louder again, and another great horned owl flies out from that roost of trees that we completely missed. Um, so in bewilderment, again, we look at the trees, don't see anything, we start to walk away, and a third great horned owl actually flew out from that roost as well. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here. This is the great horned owl here. This is one that we were able to find, obviously. But to get an idea, this is here, I'm zoomed out again. Oh, I can actually annotate this. Oh, right here. And these owls have really perfect coloration for blending in with the trees in which they roost. And they're called great horned owls because they've got these tufts on the top of their head, but they're not actually horns. They're just feathers. They're just tufts of feathers. They don't have any purpose besides, appearances. They don't function like ears or horns or anything. Um, and this helps them really blend in with the look of that landscape, where we've got all these kind of branches off at these odd angles, and their body shape and their coloration blends in absolutely perfectly with the look of that tree. So the only way that you can really see them and have a good chance of seeing them when they're roosting is when you're looking at these branches, look for something that's off at a weird angle that doesn't quite look right. Looking for an outline or a clump, something that stands out from the usual pattern here in the trees. Oftentimes when you're doing this, you'll come across a lot of like squirrel nests. They're called drays. They're these like little bundles of leaves and things that you'll see up in the tops of the tree. So don't be discouraged if the first couple times you go out there looking for something odd sticking out in the trees, if it doesn't actually turn out to be a bird. Um, this trick will work for them as well. Oop. And another reason that I think that we don't always see certain types of wildlife like this is because they're out at night. They're not out at the same time that we're out. So screech owls are a pretty abundant owl seen throughout, at least lower Michigan. You can hear them very often, especially in the winter months. Um, I've got a little screech owl call right here. And they nest in cavities, and they can actually get eaten by other owls. So you've got to be careful if you're playing calls, because they can actually have larger owls come in to eat them. So that great horned owl that I showed a little bit ago would actually eat something like a screech owl if they were able to encounter it out in the wild. And they also come in two different colors. Screech owls, you can find them in a gray morph, or you can find them in a reddish morph. So again, I want to reiterate with owls, the best time to see them is later on in the year. And going out for the most part at night, especially right after the evening, and listening to their calls and looking for something moving out in the dark. So this here is another owl. This is another winter kind of visitor. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here to help it bring out. You might notice this little dot right here. This is a snowy owl, which is an interrupter. They're not something that's normally considered like native to the area. They nest way up north in Canada, and they come down here searching for food every single year. especially the juveniles and such. And for the snowy owls, you can tell apart the males and females very easily because the males have very white coloration, very little speckling as they get older. And the females, throughout much of their life, maintain this kind of speckly pattern on their feathers. Um, Also, don't get too confused though. The young birds also look like the females. So all the birds kind of start off looking like this, but then the males, as they get older, end up becoming pure white. So you have to kind of watch for, is this a young bird or is this really a female versus an older male, where it becomes a little bit more obvious. All right, and I wanted to mention this one. This is a migratory species of bat. This is a silver-haired bat. Um, yeah. So a lot of these animals will actually stay here throughout the wintertime. You might have heard that bats will hibernate. I've heard people can sometimes get them like in attics. They get into crawl spaces where they can cause a little bit of trouble. But some of them actually migrate, and some of them stay here year-round, and they hibernate in that form. So especially during the spring and fall. You can see a lot of these groups of bats as they're out there moving through. And all the bats that we have here in Michigan are strictly insectivores. That means that they only eat insects. They don't eat fruit. We don't have anything like that here native to the state. And the way that they go about hunting is through echolocation. They bounce sound patterns off the insects and such. You may have heard that before. But this makes identifying bats in the wild very difficult, you know, if you're a naturalist or if you're somebody who's really interested in bats, because you don't get to look at them up close and really impersonal like you do with the birds, because they don't ever stay still. You don't see them actually perching like on a power line where you can zoom in and you can take a picture. So what some scientists have used, there's actually these apps and such, and they can communicate by the tone that the bats are emitting when they're out there using their echolocation. And they have devices where you can pick apart the different species of bats in your area based on that echolocation call. Something else that's kind of interesting is if you have a pair of keys, which I'm sure many of us do, many of the insects that are avoiding things like bats have learned what the frequencies are that are bouncing off of them. So when they feel that the bat is emitting that echolocation signal, it's going onto the insect, they know, oh my gosh, I might get eaten. And they do this kind of aerial maneuver where they'll try to dive bomb kind of out of the way and around the bat to make sure they're not getting eaten. And certain high frequencies that are a little bit beyond the range for humans to hear, but jingling like things like keys can sometimes mimic that frequency, and it can cause moths and different insects that are out at night to actually do this like aerial maneuvering, even though there's no bats actually around. So it's a cool thing you can try in your backyard as the weather gets warmer, and insects are definitely coming out. All right, on to some turtles. So this here is a painted turtle. This is by far the most abundant one that we've got in the state. If you've got a little pond that you maybe visit, or even like down rivers and streams, you see a turtle basking on a log, there's a very good chance that it's probably going to be a painted turtle. You can tell these guys because they've got, they don't have a lot of like structures on their shell, I guess is the way I'll put it. It's very flat, it's very domed, but there's nothing that really sticks out on the shell itself. There's other species that we have here that have like little spikes, kind of like Bowser almost, that stick out on the back of the shell. They've got a very flat shell. And they've also got this pretty, this is why they're called painted turtles. They've got this very pretty red coloration and a little bit of yellowish up on this side. And the males, like many turtle species, are a little bit smaller than the females. The females get larger because they have to actually hold the eggs and go out and lay the eggs. And painted turtles are more of a generalist in which they aren't really specific to any kind of particular habitat. And that's kind of why you find them in so many different places here in the state, because they're not picky, we'll put it that way. They're not adapted for any specific type of area, so they're able to kind of do well in a lot of different locations. I also wanted to show you this dude because especially this time of year is a good time, one of the few times a year that you can really see them. This one is called a musk turtle, and they're very small, even though they can live to be very, very old, like over 60 years old. Uh, and these guys rarely go out to bask. So whereas I think that a lot of us can expect that as you visit a park, you look out on the log, you can see a lot of these painted turtles basking on the sides. musk turtles rarely do this behavior. So you often see them either in the shallow water, where they might sometimes come a little bit out from the shallow water's edge, or walking across like wetlands and marshy kinds of areas. But this is a turtle that you don't see very often actually basking out in the open. You can see they're really little. Very, very cute. They also have another name. They're called a musk turtle. They have another name called stinkpot turtle that I think is a little bit ruder than even the musk word, um, because they can emit a foul-smelling substance when they're perceiving danger. So if they're worried that something is going to come out there and eat them, they can emit kind of like a skunk, this really foul-smelling liquid, and it smells really bad. Musks also are one of the few species that is able to do things like breathe out of their tongue. So during the wintertime, a lot of turtles, they are hibernating, just like many reptiles are, and they hibernate at the very bottom of lakes and streams, even if the top completely freezes over. And this is an animal that needs to breathe air, usually. So what they do during the wintertime is their metabolism really slows down. And a lot of these turtles, what they use is they actually breathe out of their butt. They're butt-breathing turtles, and they can get oxygen from the water that way while they're hibernating. And musk turtles are also able to do this through their tongue. They have these little structures in their tongue where they can just sit there at the bottom of the stream, and they open up their mouth, and they can exchange oxygen through these layers on their tongue, which is pretty neat. So if you do see a turtle under the ice in the wintertime, it is completely natural. That's where they're supposed to be. They're trying to hibernate. That's what they're doing. Nope. All right, and so for this image, what I want to highlight is this concept called edge habitat, which is something that humans often do, but it's not something that is exclusive to humans. So I want to show you that here we've got a forest. There's lots of trees, and normally this would be maybe an uninterrupted forest, let's say, where there's just trees, 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 and the trees go on for a very long period of time. A squirrel could theoretically jump from tree to tree and not be disturbed in any way in that travel. But then we have some kind of a change on that landscape. We have something cutting through the landscape, and that prevents trees from growing in a certain area. And in the wild, as humans, we often use these words like forest and field or marsh or wetland, but nature doesn't actually have these very definitive lines designed between what constitutes a forest, what constitutes a wetland, and so forth. And so in this period, we have kind of a transition zone where it's kind of gradually transitioning from one type of habitat to another. And we call those areas the edge. And there are certain species that are really well adapted for living on the edge. And that's exactly what's been created here from the stream flowing through the area. It's kind of cut an opening into these trees. And we've got a little bit of an edge zone between the river and the edges of the trees. And the same thing happens anytime humans come through and build something. We've got a road here in the image. And just the same way that that stream was acting, we've created edge here on the sides. And what you can notice in this picture is that unlike deeper in the woodlands, where we've got all these trees and not really a whole lot of bushy kind of structures, towards the edge zone, we've got these bushes and these plants that don't really get all that tall, that are really good at colonizing that area. And so I want to bring this up because all habitat is some kind of habitat. We have animals living wherever we are, whether we like necessarily want them to be there or not. You know, you walk outside your door, you're in some kind of animal's habitat. Certain habitats are certainly much better than others at having more species or more diversity of species, but we're always creating some kind of habitat for some kind of animal. And the kind of habitat that we create in our structures happens to be the things, it happens to attract the things that we often see the most. So the connection makes a lot of sense. So things like dandelion. The dandelion is a plant that is an edge species kind of plant. They live in these disturbed areas. Disturbed is a biological word that used to decide areas that have had some kind of a change in that landscape in a short period of time. And dandelions love that. Deer, deer are actually not a forest species. Deer are a forest edge species. So they love to live in that area where the forest is transitioning to like a wetland or a field or a marsh or some other kind of habitat. And so every time that humans build, you know, a road or a landscape or a lawn or a building here or there, we're actually creating more and more of this edge zone for different habitat, and the deer love this. So it's no mistake that we see deer all the time in Michigan, even in the middle of the city, because we're constantly creating edge habitat that the deer love. Other things that we see all the time, if you see it very often, there's a good chance that it's an edge species because that's what humans are really good at making. The American robin is an edge specialist. They love to live in the edge, and humans are really good at creating lots and lots of that edge habitat that they love. When you're watching the robins in the spring, you can also check to see if they are a male or a female by looking at the darkness of the head. So the males robins have a really dark head. You can see this especially in contrast with the back. In this picture, it's kind of grayish, gets a lot darker as it goes up towards the head. This one's a male. If you don't see that dark contrast, you know that you're looking at a female. And if you're not sure, just look at a couple different robins. You know, if you see like 5 robins out on a field, you know, look from robin to robin, and the ones that have the darker heads, those are all the males. You can tell them apart pretty quickly enough. Other birds like chickadees. This is another edge kind of specialist. This is a really cute, small, fluffy bird, and they're a namesayer. A namesayer means that the name that they're called is also what they make when they vocalize. So when you hear a chickadee calling in the springtime, they make this chickadee dee 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 kind of noise. It goes chickadee dee dee dee, and that's their name. They're called a namesayer. But they're an edge species. That's why we see them so often. Other things, tufted titmouse. This is a really common bird to feeders. If you've got a bird feeder or you know a nature center or area that's got them. Tufted titmouse are actually related to chickadees. Chickadees are actually in the tufted titmouse's family. And even though it's got kind of this crest, I've heard some people think that they're similar to like a cardinal because they both have the crest. But many different birds across many different groups have evolved this kind of crest structure. These are actually, you know, more closely related to the chickadees themselves. They're also really cute. I mentioned earlier the red-tailed hawk. How do they hunt? They sit on top of a branch and they look down into a field kind of area for small mammals to be moving underneath. What does that zone sound like where you have a positioning between a tree and a field down there? That's an edge. That's an edge zone. So that's why we see red-tailed hawks all throughout lower Michigan because we're really good at creating habitat that's really viable for them. Another one, you can keep an eye out for this one. This is a wetland kind of bird, but also really an edge specific kind of bird. This is called a yellow warbler. And they're very aptly named because it's a yellow bird, completely solid yellow. We've got a couple other birds in Michigan that are also yellow, like goldfinches, but they have some darker coloration as well on different parts of their body. The yellow warbler is almost exclusively solidly a yellow bird. So if you're in a wildlife area and you see a solid yellow bird fly into the bushes, you know, you're probably looking at a yellow warbler. And these warbler species, they eat a lot of insects. Most all birds eat insects in some way, shape, or form. But a lot of the birds that you might see like at a bird feeder will also obviously eat, you know, things like seeds and such too. Warblers are pretty heavy on the insects, so you don't really see them attending bird feeders very often. So what happens when we have lots and lots of edge habitat is it means that we see lots and lots of the species that are really adapted for the edge, but we also don't see the types of animals that would normally live in the dense, non-edge kind of habitat. So here's a cerulean warbler. This is a very rare species to be seeing in Michigan because where they like to live is these dense, large forests that have a diverse canopy. So whenever you create, you know, some kind of a, you know, a river cuts through or a road cuts through or some kind of building or structure into that forest, you're creating lots of forest edge, but you're losing deep, dense, thick forest cover. So animals that would normally rely upon that kind of habitat get lost in that process. So it makes a lot of sense about, you know, why do we see the kind of animals that we see all the time, and why don't we see a lot of things like cerulean warblers? You know, because we've eliminated a lot of their habitat and we've transitioned it into habitat for other things. Um, and a lot of animals are like this, where they have a really specific type of habitat that they need to live on. Something like the Kirtland's warbler will only nest in jack pine trees that are a particular height. So the management areas throughout the state that do this have to manage that area to have trees that are growing at all points and stages, so they have somewhere that they can nest. But the overall topic I'm getting at here is that Things that are really generalist or like to live in the edge are the things that we see very often, whereas the things that have more specializations are things that we tend to have to go to really specific locations to be able to see. And this is true for not just birds, but also for snakes. This one here, I love this picture so much. This is adorable because his eyes are so huge. And I think it just looks so cute. This is an eastern garter snake. If you see a garter snake in Michigan, chances are you're probably looking at an eastern garter because this is a generalist that lives in kind of any kind of patchwork habitat that humans have created. We have these other garter snakes too. This one is called the northern ribbon snake that is more of a wetland specialist. Whereas the garter snake will eat things like slugs and worms and toads and frogs. They don't eat things like birds or mammals. They don't have the jaw structure for that. If a garter snake actually bit a human, they can actually break their teeth on human skin. That's how fragile they are. They're really designed for just grabbing something small and swallowing it whole. They don't have any mechanism for doing that. But the ribbon snake is more of a wetland kind of snake. So they like to live where they can eat maybe some more fish, and they prefer more frogs in their diet. They're not going to be going after worms quite as much as the easterns will, even though they might eat them. And you can tell these two apart with a pretty simple trick. Just look at the chin. If the chin has a white spot on the chin, the ribbon snakes have a white underside to their chin, and the eastern garter snakes don't have this. They have their chin is kind of the same color as the rest of the snake is down the body. Garter snakes have a lot of different variation. You can see some of them that have like a blue kind of a tint to their scales. Some of them have more of a red or like an orangey tint. Usually when you see them like that, that's still in the eastern garter territory. But again, if you're unsure, just look to see if they've got that white chin. The white chin is a for sure indicator that you're looking at a northern ribbon snake instead. We also have a third species of garter snake here in Michigan that's much more uncommon, even to those other two, called the Butler's garter. I believe it's actually under consideration for protection with the DNR. And these guys, there's a couple subtle ways to tell them apart. One of the things to narrow in on is just to look at the head, the narrowness of the head. This is a snake that eats a lot more things in the undergrowth, like worms and slugs. They have a smaller head because of spending a lot more time kind of in that understory. If you go out to like a lawn and you feel around in the grass, you can kind of feel it like there's a pocket, there's a layer of things underneath that lawn where like you can stick your finger underneath kind of like a growth layer there. And there's certain animals like these that kind of gravitate more towards that kind of area. I want to mention, we do have a venomous species of snake here in Michigan called the Eastern massasauga rattlesnake. It is a federally protected species. And can you hear me now? Can you hear? Can you hear
I
me
can
now?
hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, I'm assuming I got something with my microphone. I'm gonna switch. If you can hear me now, good. Thanks for letting me know. I'm not sure quite where it cut off, so I guess I'll start. This is a massasauga rattlesnake, and we have several species here in Michigan that. Oh, let me check. We missed what you said about the rattlesnake. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. So the Eastern massasauga rattlesnakes are a really secretive animal. I actually spent many, many years of my life specifically searching to try to see one. And it was only until a year and a half ago or so that I actually saw my first one. So it's an animal that even when you're looking for it, they don't want to be found. They don't want to get eaten by big, scary honking things. They want to be kept to themselves and staying away from things. They often don't go directly on paths. They're going to be in the brush and vegetation. They're a wetland species, so they love areas that have lots of crayfish burrows, places that they can hide and stay in. And they're an ambush predator, so they don't need to move around as much as other snakes do to find their food because they're essentially waiting for food kind of to come to them, and then they strike it and swallow it whole. But one thing I want the groups to remember about the rattlesnakes, and if you're listening to the call or if you're on the recording at a later time, is that we have multiple species in Michigan that rattle their tails. Even though they're not rattlesnakes, even though they're not venomous snakes, a lot of different snakes have learned that rattling of the tail motion is a way to tell things, hey, don't eat me. Please stay away from me. I don't want to get eaten. So fox snakes will rattle their tail. Milk snakes will rattle their tail. Blue racers will rattle their tail. Black rat snakes will rattle their tail. And hognose snakes will rattle their tail. All these different snakes that you can encounter in the wild that are not venomous, completely harmless, but they will rattle their tail as if they were a rattlesnake because they're trying to say, hey, get away from me. I don't want to get eaten. And so very often what can happen is people confuse that animal with a rattlesnake and they'll actually kill it intentionally, which is very sad for the snake and sad for the ecosystem. And bear in mind, this is a protected species, so we shouldn't be killing rattlesnakes anyway. But very likely, if you see an animal that's rattling its tail, it's not an automatic indication that that animal is a rattlesnake because it's a very common trait among snakes to have that defense mechanism built in. All right, and here, this is a milk snake. I want to mention this one because this is one that I've so often heard confused with the rattlesnake, even though it's got a very different body here. So look at the rattlesnake, how stocky and large and thick the snake is. Milk snakes, on the other hand, are really skinny and slender. They spend a lot of their time crawling into holes and like they've got to go into burrows and things to find their food. The massasauga doesn't have that same kind of adaptation for it. Milk snakes also often have a Y-shaped structure on the top of their head, and often they're very red too. I guess it can happen, but rarely are the massasaugas a reddish color like the milk snake can be. But milk snakes also come in other tints too. I've seen them with kind of an orangey or brown kind of tints as well. It's not an automatic indication of that. And with that, we're getting at about time. So I want to make sure that I open it up for questions so that I can hear your thoughts about, what kind of wildlife you'd like to see more of. And I hope with that, you've heard at least an overview of some of the different types of animals that you can see out there, so you know how to go out there and look for them. And I want to remind too, before the program is over, that optics can really make a difference. The difference between having a spotting scope and not means, can I identify those birds and animals that are way out there in the distance, or is that something that's going to forever remain elusive to me? So having the right optics when you're outside can really make the difference in telling these things apart. All right, and with that, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And you can unmute or you can put things in the chat, either or.
Andrew, I guess I'll start. I had a question about squirrels.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up and for the longest time, I just saw like brown or orange squirrels. But lately, probably in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been
The black ones?
Yes.
Yep.
And they kind of like, now see more black ones than the orange ones. Do you know why that happened?
So if you read old field guides talking about different mammals in Michigan, I can't remember exactly what edition I'm thinking of, but there's one guide that actually advertised the black squirrels in Michigan. There's this one particular like area that started to have them. And they've since kind of like, spread and now you can see them out throughout the state. But it used to only be one or two areas in Michigan that had the black variants of the gray squirrels. It's actually the gray squirrels that get that coloration. And since then, that trait has kind of passed on, and you can now see them throughout the entire state. But not so long ago, that wasn't a thing. So your observation is correct that variant has spread, but it's not a different species. It's just a different color morph of the same thing that you're kind of already seeing. Earlier in the presentation, I didn't talk about squirrels, but I did talk about the chipmunk. Squirrels will also do kind of an alarm call in the same way. They'll kind of like make this barking noise. They'll be sitting up there in the tree. They see something scary. So it's another sound that you can kind of learn and cue in on. They'll make like this. I don't do it very well with my noise. It sounds like a bark when they call from a tree. We also have a couple other species. We have red squirrels and fox squirrels in the state as well. I think those are the main three. Red squirrel, fox squirrel, and gray squirrel. Yeah, there's a lot of wildlife that I wasn't able to squeeze, into an hour presentation that we could keep going on. But I hope that maybe you guys heard about some animals that maybe you didn't think that you could see out here in Michigan before, and some ways that you can go about trying to look and experience them. Any other questions about any kind of wildlife topic or something from the presentation?
Well, Mara says, enjoyed this presentation. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Have you seen any coyote or fox in the Dearborn area? The answer is yes, they're there. I can talk about, I guess I'll start with coyotes. So coyotes are an animal that is really abundant in a lot of different spaces in the state, and they will go straight into urban areas. I mean, you can see coyotes like in downtown Detroit and downtown Grand Rapids. They just go down there. But they're also really talented at avoiding people. They know that people are potential predators for them, and they're very used to staying very far away. I think this is an animal that's also historically used to living like with alongside wolves and other kinds of large predators too. They've got to stay away from them. Very often people don't see them even though they're there because of that trait. They're also mainly nocturnal. They're out at nighttime. We're not usually spending as much time out in the dark. But if you do hear them, which is I think probably the most effective way to experience coyotes is when you hear them, they make this kind of like a yipping noise. And it's different from a wolf, where a wolf howl is kind of like this, and it sounds like a musical note that's being played across a long period of time. And coyotes kind of have like a laugh, but they kind of add like a bunch of these weird notes into it. It's like kind of thing. But when the coyotes are doing that call, that howl, they'll often change their tone and like their frequency so fast that if you're listening to them in an area, it can sound like there's a whole lot more coyotes there than there actually are. So it can sound like it's a group of like 15 or 20 of them, but it's only like actually like maybe 4 or 5 that are just sounding like they're a much larger group than is there. There have been efforts to cull the population of coyotes in certain areas. There's been a lot of research that's gone into this. Cull is a word for reducing the population. Regardless of what your thoughts are on that, but they found that it's actually virtually impossible to impact coyote populations because the act of removing a coyote from the population actually stimulates their ability to like make more of themselves. And there's so much territory and so much places that they can take advantage of throughout a state because they're really adapted for the kind of habitats that humans create for them. That as soon as any individuals are removed from that area, they're quickly replacing them, and the population just bounces right back again. So they're going to be here, and we're going to have to live with them. They're not going away, and they usually stay out of trouble. They don't want to interact with people in any way, shape, or form. Fox. So we have 2 foxes in Michigan. We have red fox and we have gray fox. The ones that you see more in like a city kind of setting are usually red fox, because that is naturally a field or meadow kind of species, but they're also very good at taking advantage of some of the more urban scapes. And sometimes you can see them even like looking at like trash areas and so forth too, although maybe not to the same degree as raccoons. But then you can also see them on the countryside out in like fields and such like that. They're not very good tree climbers at all. And the red fox, again, it's got a reddish coloration of their fur, and they've got a white tip on their tail. The other species that we have, the gray fox, is much smaller, and that's one that you're not going to see in urban kind of settings because they are a deep forest kind of animal. Kind of like in my presentation, I mentioned the cerulean warbler that doesn't want to be in disturbed areas. They want to be out there in the middle of the forest, and they're really good at climbing trees. They're going right up these things like a squirrel. In fact, the first time I ever saw a gray fox, I thought that I saw a giant squirrel because it's a big animal with a big bushy tail that ran right up a tree. But it was a fox. And like the other animals, they're really elusive to people. The only way that you're really going to see them is if you're hiking deep in the woods and you're being very quiet, and you're really looking around about and observing the world about you. You've got to kind of almost sneak up on them sometimes because they smell or hear people coming and they get out of there. They don't want you to know they're there, but they're still there. We just don't see them very often. I hope that answered your questions.
Question about skunks.
Mm-hmm.
Often when I'm driving, I smell the skunk smell.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean it's bad news for the skunk that was killed? Or
I'm not gonna say 'cause I don't specifically know. Skunks don't always just spray because they felt some kind of a danger. They use their spray actually for other mechanisms too, like there's a means of communication and like ways of telling where skunks are using that spray. So if there's a area that the skunk calls home, like a burrow or somewhere that they're inhabiting, you can go by their home and it'll smell faintly of skunk. Um, so just because you smell skunk, it does not necessarily mean that the skunk had actually sprayed in order to deter a predator, because they use it for other things too. And the areas that they live in just kind of naturally have, not naturally, it leaks out and then they get hints of that scent in their areas too. Um, so, I mean, I don't really want to say one way or the other because it could very well have just been that something scared it and sprayed in that area. It could have been, like you said, that it got squashed and, the spray was released that way. Or it could just be that it inhabits that particular area, so it might smell like skunk all the time because there's a skunk living in that particular place.
so when it is killed, it does release the smell.
Um, I'm not 100% sure on that, so I want to be careful that I don't say. Yeah, I'm not confident.
All right, well, thank you.
Yeah.
You said you were going to leave information to
Oh,
contact.
yeah. Let me. Oop, I gotta stop the screen share here and get that up. So if you'd like to contact me for other programs, or if you just have like a nature question, you want to send me an email, I'll try to get back to you. This is my website. It's got a few guides on there, but mostly it's my contact information is there. So there's my email and phone number. Please use email unless it's something like specific or urgent. They've got to reach out to me for. But I'm happy to, if someone sees a cool thing of wildlife or you want to ask like a random question. I've had people ask me questions before that I didn't know the answer to, and I'll do the best I can to reach out to someone or find out a way to access information to help you about your needs, and a lot of stuff too. I can just answer on the spot. So I'm happy to engage that way. So yeah, if you want to get in touch. Also, other programs and things too. So I kind of touched on a lot of different stuff on this program. I also will do stuff where I'll get on something really specific. Like I can talk about snowy owls for an hour. I can talk about snakes for an hour, or something more positioned that way too. Or mammals, and like we can just sit here and talk about opossums and raccoons and skunks and weasels and such.
Um, I see that there's a question in the chat. It says, any idea what this animal we saw in the backyard is? It was weasel-like, walked low to the ground with no legs visible. So we do have weasels in Michigan. We have several species of them actually. Weasel is kind of a family of organisms. So ones that I know we have in the area are minks. We also have short-tailed weasels here as well. A short-tailed weasel is really small, maybe not even a foot long. It's hard for me to visualize without seeing you there in person and be able to hold up my hands. But they're also really, really skinny. So they don't have a lot of girth to them. So like a squirrel, even though they're really short, they've got a very chunky body. Weasels have a really slender, very skinny body to them. So often if you see them, it looks almost like a snake with legs from a distance. Weasels in general, like I mentioned, like the coyotes and the gray fox, they are really good at avoiding people. So it's just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. Just because you saw it once doesn't mean it didn't stick around. You know that they're intentionally trying to avoid being seen. We also have mink, which is a larger, more of a wetland species. That might fit that description. It's kind of hard for me to say without more information or a picture. We also have muskrat. I'm not sure if you know what that is, Mary. To be able to say no to that one. Muskrat are a common wetland animal. They look kind of like a miniature beaver, but they're much smaller. They've got a rat-like tail. They also walk kind of close to the ground as well. It had a white tip tail. Okay, it's a weasel. Yep, 100%. So the short-tailed weasels, they've got another name that I just learned actually last week. Apparently, I think it's ermine. I learned it as a short-tailed weasel. Ermine or stoat, I guess, is another common name. So it's the same species, just they have different names for them sometimes. But yes, they have a brown body with a black. Wait, I got it backwards. A brown body with a white tip tail during the summertime. And during the wintertime, they actually will shift. And then the tail tip becomes black and the body will become white to blend in with the snow. So if you saw that sounds exactly like the description of a short-tailed weasel. And that sounds really incredible because I'll tell you, I've only seen a handful of them myself in my life. It's a very elusive animal, a very difficult animal to photograph. That's really cool that you saw that. All right. Well, if there isn't any more questions, you've got my email, and I wish everybody a good week. And I hope that maybe you can go out and maybe experience more in the outdoors, even if it's just driving and you look up and see a bird flying, and you can tell it's a vulture because it's got that V shape, or it's an eagle because it's got the wings outstretched. It really means a lot to me when people are able to enjoy and get excited about nature, just like I am.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very good presentation.